Greetings, grammarians. In this video, we'll take up a wide-angle lens to look at big grammar. That is, grammar beyond the sentence, with a special focus on genre and cohesion. You'll recall that Larson Freeman and Celso Murcia divide grammar into three levels. The first is the subsentential level, which consists of words and phrases, morphology, etc. The second is the sentential level, which is the level that typically comes to mind when we think of grammar. That is, sentences, clauses, and their structural relations in syntax. The third level is the suprasentential level, and it's concerned with text or discourse, that is, grammar beyond the sentence. And it's this last level that is the focus of this video. By looking at grammar at this level, we are moving away from the rigid structural rules of English syntax to look at grammar from above. And we're interested in the patterns that emerge in whole texts across different discourse areas. So rather than looking at small grammatical bits and the syntactic connections among them, we want to see big grammar, the broad regions of text and how they interact. That is, a more global view of English grammar. And to do this, the first suprasentential perspective we'll take up is genre, which broadly refers to the discourse patterns that make up whole texts. And by text here, I'm referring to both written and spoken texts. That is, any discourse unit with an identifiable beginning, middle, and end. The second perspective is cohesion, which is concerned with the grammatical and lexical connections in texts. Let's start with the first of these, genre. In the world around us, we can see various activities that we and others routinely carry out. For example, we entertain and educate by telling stories. And in doing so, we're using a narrative or story genre. As we'll see, this genre and others have quite predictable stages and sequences of information, which can be a useful instructional aid for teachers. And in the world around us, you'll see people report the news in order to inform others. And this implicates the news report genre, which again has a fairly predictable and formulaic informational flow. Of course, this and other genres can also be exploited for nefarious purposes to misinform or disinform, but it will typically adhere to the same conventionalized discourse structure. Another thing we do, often in academic settings, is convince or persuade others of our viewpoints using the short essay genre. As you can see, genres are not static linguistic structures. They perform important social and cultural functions. And this is apparent in the various definitions of genre, which include Jim Martin's description of them as staged, goal oriented social processes, or even more simply as the ways in which people get things done through the use of language in particular contexts. We'll look at each of these three genres in turn, but first I should mention that all of the samples we'll look at are pedagogic texts, so their overarching purpose is to teach learners. Please just keep this in mind as we go through them. The narrative generic structure is one you've seen before, but I wanted to review it so that we can compare it with other genres. You'll recall that the first stage of this genre is the abstract, which is actually optional, meaning it may be observed in some, but not all, instances of the genre. It's often just a brief comment or segue into the story, something like, "Hey, I know a great story," or "A strange thing happened to me the other day." After such introductory comments, there is the orientation stage. At this stage, we are oriented to the setting and we meet the characters, learn about them, find out about their past and where they're going. This stage is critical for orienting us to the next stage, which is the complication. This is where our hero confronts some kind of problem or obstacle that they are forced to overcome in some way. And how they decide to deal with this problem is called the evaluation stage. And at this point, they will decide or realize the best course of action, which in this case happens to be going around the problem and boldly going off road to get to the destination. And this takes us to the resolution stage. And fortunately for our hero, this is a happy ending as she drives off unobstructed into the sunset on her way to her destination. As for the optional coda at the end, like the abstract, this is an optional stage. Basically, it's the moral of the story. It is more commonly used in children's stories, and I'm not sure what the moral of our story is. Do your best, never give up, buy a big truck. All right, let's look at a better story. This is a delightful little children's story that I found at the source cited below. I've added an abstract at the beginning that states, "This story teaches us an important lesson about adversity and perseverance. Please read the story and see if you can identify the stages on the left, 2 through 6. Here's my analysis. And as you can see, the moral or coda of this story is much more powerful than our previous one. The story is a universal genre across all cultures. And some have even argued that humans are hardwired for story and that this genre played a critical role in human evolution, providing the cultural bonds for early humans to form communities and cooperate in pursuit of common goals, especially survival. There's also interesting variation in the narrative genre across cultures, including Western varieties and the Japanese Kisho Tenketsu story structure. Please check this out if you're interested. All right, that's all for the narrative genre. Let's move on to the news report. As we'll see, this genre has some points of similarity with the narrative, but there are also some critical differences between them. The first stage is the all important lead, which contains the most important information and deals with the questions of who, what, where, when, etc. This stage packs together much of the critical, newsworthy information. The second stage is the body, and this also contains crucial information, though less sensational than the lead. We might see evidence, background, details, etc., including quotes from interviews with authorities and other central people in the story, as well as eyewitness reports or reactions and opinions of others involved. The final stage is the tale, and it contains the least important information, such as other related information or the view of the journalist who might offer a closing comment or some extra context. So you can see the organizing principle of this genre is the informational value, with the most important at the beginning and the least important at the end. The generic structure outlined here is actually an abbreviated version of The Oft-Cited Inverted Pyramid by Christopher Schwartz. This has more detail than my schematic, so have a read if you're interested. Here's a very short news article titled Rebels Defeat Assad in Syria. The reason it's so short is it's a pedagogic text from BBC Learning English in the news. It's graded upper intermediate level, but you'll see it conforms pretty neatly to the generic structure we've looked at. Please have a read and see if you can identify the genre stages. And here's my analysis. I think this one's pretty straightforward. Now let's compare the narrative and the news report. Here's the narrative on the left and the news report on the right. A key organizing principle of the narrative is time. That is, it follows a temporal sequence, moving from earlier to later events. Obviously, there are exceptions to this with flashbacks and media ray, but generally, narratives are ordered by time. This is not the case with contemporary news reports. In this genre, the narrative timeline is displaced or broken. That's because the complication or the problem, that is the juicy part of the story, is fronted or pushed forward to the lead, disrupting the narrative flow. And much of the orientation and background information is then demoted to the body of the article. So, why is conflict foregrounded in the lead? I'm sure you can guess: economics, or more to the point, profit. In the late 19th century, as broadsheet news grew in popularity, newspapers competed to attract readers, often by using the most sensationalist, attention grabbing headlines, giving rise to the old well tread saying, if it bleeds, it leads. So, in comparison with the narrative, the news article is very recent, and as we'll see, the last genre we'll look at is even more recent than the news article. It's the short essay. Probably anyone who has taught writing is familiar with its generic structure. It usually goes something like this: there's an opinion about the topic, like hockey is the best sport, which as a Canadian also happens to be a correct statement. I joke. But teachers often call this opinion a topic sentence, or in longer essays, a thesis statement. Then there is a reason for the writer's opinions, like hockey requires a great deal of skill, and I'll need to then provide an explanation for this with examples and details, like players need to make skilled plays and quick decisions at very high speeds. And then the next step is just rinse and repeat, where steps 2 and 3 are simply repeated, and the opinion is just restated at the end. All right, let's see an example. Please have a read and see if you can identify the 5 parts. And here's what I got. This generic structure goes by many names, but in EFL contexts, it's often called paragraph writing. I don't use this term because, well, nobody really writes paragraphs. They write in genres, which may include one or more paragraphs, but you'd be hard pressed in the world to find someone paid to write paragraphs. Moreover, most paragraphs are not actually structured this way, which is why I prefer short essay. And such short essays are a direct descendant of the 5 paragraph theme. This writing frame is ubiquitous in L1 and L2 North American writing classrooms. It gained traction in the post war era and the rapid expansion of universities because it enabled instructors to efficiently grade student papers. They could quickly check if the 5 paragraph theme elements were present or absent, saving a lot of time for busy instructors burdened with a growing student body. In recent years, many, including me, have been highly critical of this structural formula, and many would say it is not a genre at all. It's a structural text type or rhetorical template with very little real world utility. When teaching such rhetorical formats, the emphasis is typically on the production of this linguistic form rather than the communicative goals of the writer and the social context in which it's written. Nonetheless, it's still extremely common in L1 and L2 instruction, so I wanted to view it alongside the other pedagogic texts we've looked at. For a historical overview and a detailed critique of this text type, please see Kaplan and Johns 2019. Okay, so up to now, we've looked at 3 genres. I've modeled their discourse stages using pedagogic texts, and we can see how these stages are connected and used by writers to achieve their social and communicative goals. But these are big chunks of discourse. If we look closely, we can identify other, more subtle ways connections are formed in these genres. And to do this, we'll look at some grammatical resources for cohesion. And I'll be relying on the highly influential work in this area by Halliday and Hassan. So let's start by looking at something that is not cohesive. Imagine you read this in the orientation stage of a story. Betty drove a truck, a crow is in the kitchen, we can't find the hockey player, my sister loves sushi. Obviously, you would have a hard time making sense of this and probably give up on the story rather quickly. The text is grammatical, at least at the sentence level, but the sentences are not connected. Now, let's compare this with the previous story we looked at. Now, this story makes sense, but why is that? How specifically are the sentences connected together? The first thing you might have noticed is the use of personal pronouns, especially he, to refer back to the crow, as well as non personal pronouns in the use of it and them. And we'll just use the term pronoun for this cohesive tie. You may have also noted the use of adverbial connectors, including the adverbial subordinator after, the logical connector finally, as well as the conjunction but, and the signal word then, which is repeated twice. Most of these are temporal markers, which is not surprising considering the centrality of the timeline in narrative discourse. In this grammar, all of these connectors fall under the broad functional category of conjunction. Now, another kind of connection you might have noticed is repetition. Many of the same words are repeated throughout the passage, including thirsty, water, drink, crow, and pot. And this reliance on the repetition of words to connect sentences is also unsurprising. Repetition is an especially effective technique in children's stories for facilitating language acquisition. As repetition relies on the meanings of words to form connections, Halliday and Hassan call this lexical cohesion, and the other two are considered grammatical cohesion. I haven't covered all of the cohesive ties in this passage, but I think this gives us a good glance at some of the key cohesive resources at work in this genre. All right, let's turn to our second genre, which is the news report, and we can see our sample here. So, how does this passage compare with the previous one? First, you'll note there are far fewer instances of pronoun. Moreover, I was only able to find one occurrence of conjunction in the coordinating conjunction but. So, from a cohesion standpoint, this particular news passage is very different from the narrative text. However, one similarity is that, like the news story, this text contains a great deal of lexical repetition. And this may not be a feature of the news report genre more broadly. It may just be frequent here because it's a short pedagogic text. One other cohesive tie I noted here is synonymy. We can see an example of synonymy in take control and defeat. In this context, they can be considered somewhat synonymous. Okay, let's move on to the short essay. Here's the sample we looked at previously. Any thoughts on how this one might be similar to or different from the others? All right, let's take a look. There are several instances of pronoun I, so this particular exemplar may not be very reflective of academic discourse more broadly, as academic discourse tends to avoid personal pronouns. How about conjunction? We can see multiple instances of conjunction, especially in the form of sentence initial logical connectors. But these are quite different from the temporal markers in the narrative. These are mostly additives that function to sequence textual information rather than real world events. And again, we have a great deal of repetition. And this may be more to do with it being a short pedagogic text. I didn't note any instances of synonymy, but I did find a few examples of antonymy, which uses opposites to form a cohesive tie, like often and rarely, and expensive and affordable. One other type of lexical cohesion that seems important for organizing this genre is superordination, where you have a general category like advantages in the first sentence, followed by specific instances of advantages, like here we have the three specific advantages: safe, friendly, and affordable. This resource of subordination provides the hierarchical backbone upon which this informational structure depends. Now, let's look at the three genres and their cohesion resources side by side. Just a quick glance at the color patterns of these texts show that they are very different. As you can see, a cohesion analysis very much complements a genre analysis. Together, they provide a rich description of these texts. Depending on your teaching context, it may be helpful to raise learners' awareness of these grammatical patterns beyond the sentence. But when doing so, it's useful to keep in mind a few things. With grammar beyond the sentence, there are no rules, only patterns. And it's important that we as teachers communicate this to students. Instead of saying your essay must contain signal words at the beginning of each sentence, we can draw learners' attention to these resources, model them, and show not how they are used, but how they tend to be used. Second, grammatical categories can be fuzzy. What does this mean? The genres we looked at were very neat and tidy. The stages were pretty clear cut, and it was apparent when one ended and the next began. And that's because I wanted to illustrate various patterns. But most genre samples you encounter will not be so clear cut. They will be much messier, and the boundaries between grammatical features will be fuzzier and indistinct. A third important point is big grammar patterns are, or should be, socially purposeful. Throughout this video, I've tried to offer a historical perspective on the origins of different genres, looking at the social context in which they emerged and highlighting their purposes and some of their problematic features. Obviously, you won't do all this in your classes, but I hope this has helped to underscore the social dimension of big grammar and the importance of focusing learners' attention not just on what grammar is, but what it does. Thank you for watching. Here are my references. See you in class.